what housing policy existed in Canada in the past?
Okay, so housing's been very important, obviously, to us. When we think about homelessness, obviously housing is quite key. And so we've had several different policies over time. I think one consistent element or bias of housing policy in Canada has always been to allow the market to be preeminent, and for only the government or public authorities, even the social housing sector, to intervene, to really kind of pick up some of the pieces. But really the bias has been to try to allow the private market to do its job and provide housing for Canadians. And even when we sought to provide housing for lower income groups or to create what's called affordable housing, we often do that by subsidizing private market developers or so on to try to create those units. So there's always been that bias. But there's been moments when the government has become more active. And these have been important moments in our history because they did create a certain number of what you might call publicly owned and operated or socially owned and operated units, which were geared towards lower income people, which were quite important in our history. And in part, we can think about more contemporary dynamics of homelessness as partly being a result of a rolling back of some of those programs, but also other dynamics that are happening in the housing market more generally. So if I think back about some of the key ones, again, before really World War II, there weren't a lot of major federal or provincial housing interventions. I think the Dominion Housing Act was created in 1935, was not that substantial. And even these early ones, 1935, I think the National Housing Act was first brought in 1938. These ones, again, were very much about trying to subsidize the creation of private rental, private home ownership units by providing help to provide mortgages for people and so on. So I think those early ones were really, again, towards that. I think the first time you actually see, if I recall reading the actual words public housing was in 1946 National Housing Act, and that was really an important change because you began to see the federal government then want to intervene much more forcefully into producing and creating affordable housing. I mean, during in the early 1940s, there was the wartime housing program, which provided several thousand units of housing for people who came to work in the war effort, as the cities came, as people moved to the cities to help in the war mobilization effort, and that created a massive housing problem in major cities in the country. So the federal government did intervene. Although that was meant to be temporary housing, they didn't want that to be permanent because they didn't want to again have the government intervening too long. So really by the late 1940s, when you begin to get the government intervening more effectively. But really, it's not until the 1960s that you begin to see the federal government working with, begin to take a really strong effort. And then you start to see for several years the government intervening, using the National Housing Act amendments to intervene much more effectively, taking a lead. You know, the provincial governments were not necessarily that active. You know, some cities were, some provinces were. Ontario, was active already by the 50s and in the late 40s. In Toronto, oftentimes they asked the municipalities to kick in and provide funding, and so different cities were more or less willing to do so. So Ontario's had a lot of that going on in comparison to other provinces. So you get a lot of that happening through the 1960s period particularly. Then in the 1973, you get the National Housing Act amendments, which begins to you get to see the introduction or the establishment of the not-for-profit sector, or social housing. So movement from strictly just government creating and building housing to saying, you know, we're not doing this great job. This is when you start to get discussions around slum housing. Oh, we're doing a very bad job of this. We're creating slums. We're all that kind of stigmatization that happens. And so by 1973, you get the Housing Act amendments that begin to create cooperative housing and social housing and bring in kind of third sector partners, income mixing programs. A lot of the social housing amendments about income mixing. These nonprofit housing providers create, low income, but also want to bring in some market renters, so that helps subsidize the project. Cooperative housing, the greatest example being the St. Lawrence Market District in Toronto, where the people actually begin to own the housing cooperatively. But then by 1990s, by the 80s, that's already now beginning to unwind. A lot of cutbacks to housing, and then in 1995, 1993 to 95, you get again cutbacks. The federal government moves out entirely of creating new social housing, public housing in 1993, and so on. I can talk about that later on if we want to. Some of the cutbacks.
That's a great summary, and really appreciate it. We've been hearing from people when we're talking about the history about that idea of providing housing for people around the war effort, and whether that was on the government's part or whether that was something that the people really had to demand, and in particular soldiers coming back. So really interesting.
After the war coming back, Regent Park and so on. I know, what's interesting about a lot of the federal government programs, even early on, if you read again, like Hochansky or John Basher or other people, talking about how even those earlier programs in the 30s and 40s, it was often about creating jobs, right, and helping the industry as opposed to creating affordable housing. So again, more about the economic side of it than actual helping people in need. So it's interesting.